your radius. In fact, they have a fracture called a boxer's fracture when you don't punch right and you hit it with your fifth, because that's not angled correct to dissipate force. That's like taking the egg on the side, and it's going to crack a lot easier. So these two line up with the corporal bones to help absorb and transfer force to the radius. So that's one way that those corporal bones really help to transfer and absorb force by being stacked on each other. The other way is when our wrist is extended. So watch, this is pretty cool. If I could find it. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. Okay? So because the corporal bones don't glide, I mean, you don't really have, again, a lot of dominoes, when we move that scaphoid and lunate and all the corporal bones go with it, well, now we reposition the corporal bones to take load on the front. In other words, when we're punching, we're kind of taking load in on the heads of the corporal bones. But when we extend, we reposition those corporal bones so that they're all kind of laying on their tummy on the radius, and they can all help absorb force anterior to posterior. So when you're loading, you see the don't do this? Well, because if you have the force way over here, it's gonna put your wrist in an extended position of extension, maybe even hyper if you go too far. But when you reposition the corporal bones to lay down on their back and be front up, you can help dissipate force through the corporal bones to help transfer that force to the radius. Okay. So two main ways that those corporals can reposition themselves to help absorb and redistribute force. Okay. So unlike the tarsal bones, really not a lot of summation of movement. Dissipation of force, mostly, okay? Really good at dissipation of force. So, what can the wrist do? In terms of motions, you could look at your book on the wrist lecture. It's an ellipsoid, a biaxial ellipsoid. That means biaxial, it can move about two axes. These two axes are AP axis and bilateral axis. There is no transverse plane motion at the wrist. My little catch word is the wrist does not twist. Your radial ulnar joint, as I'm going to teach you, twist, but you cannot take your wrist joint, put your arm against your side, and spin it. It's not going anywhere. And I told you the biggest reason, well, maybe I told you, maybe I didn't, I apologize. You're wired, man. You have way too many wires that run through these little tunnels to twist them around. You have way too many vessels that go inside there. You kind of need to maintain your plumbing. So we have a secondary joint that allows you to reposition your hand if you need, while still maintaining all the plumbing and the wiring where they need to go in all these little grooves. Okay? If our wrist was allowed to twist, that would be a real bad day for our vessels and our grooves. Okay? So the wrist doesn't twist. The wrist can move in its sagittal plane. All right? Let's see. Does your ink pen work? Does anybody have a Sharpie? Anybody have a Sharpie? Whoa, Sharpie. You have it out? Let's do it, man. Did you give, nice. Now what color would you say this is? I'm an 8-set Crayola kind of color guy, right? So I'm always fascinated with new colors. In fact, I actually had, my mom was kind of surprised, I had a date for homecoming in high school. And my mom was like, you have to find out what color her dress is. You got to find out. Like, all right. So I was like, what color is your dress? And she was like, fuchsia. I was like, okay, cool. And then my mom was like, well, what color is the dress? I said, Mom, I don't think she understood my question. My mom was, oh, that's a color. All right, anyway. Here's my wrist perspective. Remember, true anatomical, everybody sees the same thing. The room, my eyes, and all my players on my team are all looking the same way. So in true anatomical position, my wrist sees sagittal plane rotation. One is going to get my wrist more into fetal, and the other is going to get my wrist out of fetal. In anatomical position of the wrist, I can move in two different directions. It's not like the knee where it's at the end of its road. I can move in a direction of flexion or be flexed. I can move in a direction of extension or be extended from anatomical, right? I can have flexion to anatomical, and I can have flexion from anatomical. I could have extension to anatomical, I could have extension from anatomical. Again, why is that important? Goniometry stuff, right? You're gonna have to do angles, and when you're measuring someone's range of motion, typically you do it from anatomical position. How far did you go back from here? How far did you go forward from there? And you can add those two and get a full, overall range of motion, but it's important to reference things to and from, okay? Now, in addition to sagittal plane stuff, we get some frontal plane motion. And I put a picture of myself. This was about a couple years ago. I was doing this new training program called Delcom Fit, and I tried it for a little while, and it's pretty cool. It might be touched up a little bit, all right, for a couple of my blemishes. But the point is that having frontal plane motion of our wrist help extensively with a concept that I'm going to introduce to you today called your functional circle of grip. And it's not a scientific term. You're not going to find it in any textbook. It's just a concept. It just means that for us to be able to do what we do as humans, gripping, tasking, articulating with our fingers is of importance. And we need to be able to put our fingers in infinitely many positions in the X, Y, Z to be able to grab things, do things, hold on to things, catch things, throw things. And one of the ways our wrists contribute is by moving in the frontal plane. So for this one, for example, as I raise the bar up, if my wrist wasn't able to move in its frontal plane, I'd have a problem here because I'm not going to snap the bar in two. By being able to move my wrist in the frontal plane, I'm able to keep my fingers under the bar. If I wasn't able to move like this, I'd be kind of stuck, or I wouldn't have as many options. When you're grabbing things and holding on to things, having the wrist be able to kind of shift and move in the frontal plane helps you to maintain grip on things. There's other reasons too. If you're hitting a hammer, the wrist kind of helps give a last little whip, like the tip of the towel. There's some other functions too. But the main thing is that when we're working and moving, having that wrist, imagine, heaven forbid, you're walking with a full glass of beer, right? Root beer or butter beer, whatever kind of beer you drink. And being able to shift and give to keep what's in your hand level, right? Your body may move, you may be going downstairs, but being able to have deviations in your wrist has a lot of practical importance. Okay? So the two main planes of motion in our wrist, we need to account for sagittal, and we need to account for frontal. Got to call them something. Remember, every plane of motion is going to have two different ways of spin, clockwise, counterclockwise. So that's how we get the flexion extension, in fetal, out of fetal. And then the frontal planes, we call those deviations. Here's the easiest, I say easiest, here's a technique that you can learn from. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Knowing that the wrist doesn't twist gives us empowerment to know that our pinky, right, will always and forever be ulna side. It can't not be, unless you dislocate something or if you have a really bad day. The pinky will always be splinted to the ulna, and that's because the wrist doesn't twist. If the wrist was able to rotate, then I could flip my thumb to my ulna side, or flip my pinky to my radial side. But because the wrist doesn't spin in its transverse plane, the pinky will always be splinted to the ulna side. So what does that mean about your thumb and the radius? They will also be splinted to each other's side. The thumb will always be radial side. And the pinky, forever and ever, in normal functioning people, will be ulna side. So, two ways to look at these deviations. One is, If your fingers deviate pinky side, that's to the ulna deviation. And if your fingers deviate to the radial side, that's radial deviation. Ulna deviation, radial deviation. Okay. It's possible that when they were naming these things, they took into account, unlike, like, why didn't they just say ab and adduction? Well, when you're ab and adducting, you know, it's kind of like one bone, one bone. Well, here the radius and the ulna are two bones, a chicken wing bone, right? So you kind of have deviation to one of the long bones or deviation to the other long bone. Probably why they took that into consideration. Okay? Does that make sense? Another way you can look at it is your middle finger. Your middle finger is kind of like a plumb bob, right? Your middle finger is Switzerland. We got 2 on the medial side, 2 on the lateral side. The middle finger kind of stays in the middle. So if you're kind of confusing about pinky side, thumb side in terms of all the fingers, just go with the middle finger. If the middle finger deviates towards the ulna deviation. Middle finger deviates towards the radius, radial deviation. It looks like it's moving, and it is. It looks like it's not moving, and it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. Let's see, maybe if I did something like this or this, right, where you see the whole joint move, but that doesn't necessarily mean a head wrist motion. Okay. So for the wrist, I'm foreshadowing only because it's very important. Because the radial ulnar joint, which I'm going to lecture on when we get back from break, can reposition the hand. And basically what's happening is the radius is wrapping and unwrapping itself. Y'all have heard of the position of prone and supine, right? A prone position, a supine position. That's how this gets its name. It has nothing to do with a darn soup bowl. I don't like that. And that's going to get you into trouble. I'm going to show you when we go over our head. You know what it really means? When you're in anatomical position, the radius is supine. And when it wraps itself over the ulna, it goes prone. It goes face down. And when it unwraps, it comes back to being supine. Pronation, the act of going prone. Supination, the act of going supine. But the point is that pronation and supination repositions the hand for a functional circle of grip. You want to be able to grip in a 360 degree of motion. But that doesn't change the position of the wrist joint. What I mean by that is a lot of students will get ulnar and radial deviation confused on the test because they want to bring it to global references. In anatomical position, it just so happens that my ulnar deviations occurs medially. But if I wrap my radius around the ulna, my ulnar deviation goes lateral from a global reference. But from my wrist perspective, it's still the exact same thing. So that's going to be where we're going to have to work on it. Ulnar deviation can look like this. Ulnar deviation can look like that. Or ulnar deviation can look like this. Ulna, radial. Ulna, radial. Thumb side, pinky side. Thumb side, pinky side. So it's not a globally referenced thing, and that's why I don't say it's not that I don't like it. It can get you into trouble if you say, oh, this motion is when that goes there. You know what I'm saying? When you use these global concepts, sometimes it works, but local concepts always work. Okay. Right wrist flexion, right wrist extension, right wrist ulnar deviation, right wrist radial deviation. Left extension, flexion, ulnar, radial. Okay. Let's see. Okay, what position would this guy's wrist be in the wrist's frontal plane of motion?
So you see, I'm not disrespecting the sagittal, it's just that that's a tough angle to really see sagittal, but it's a better angle to see frontal. Okay? So which one do we know in terms of his wrist position there in the wrist frontal plane? Is he radial deviated or ulna deviated? Ulna deviated, yeah. And again, the wrist allows that so that he can keep his fingers on whatever the heck he's trying to pick up. You know, the bar is all the way across. If his wrists weren't able to ulna deviate, he'd start here and then he'd have to, having that motion allows you to keep your fingers under stuff. Like gliding. That's not really a glide. All right, let's see some more practice. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Let's see if we have some. Okay. Now. See these people, that's why you gotta watch, man. They don't understand, man. So, again, to alleviate some of the confusion. So, the radial, remember how I said at the ankle and subtalar joint live very close together. So it's easy to see how they might be in the same, they might live in the same apartment, but they don't. They live in the same apartment complex, but they don't literally live in the same apartment. So your radial ulna joint, where your radius wraps around your ulna, if I wrap my head around my partner, my feet are gonna move as well. Now my head stays on my pillow, but I could wrap my body around and then unwrap my body around, okay? It's a silly analogy that I like to use. I could wrap my body around my partner or unwrap while still keeping my head on my pillow. That's how the radius works. Now, the head rotates proximally and the feet rotate distally. So your feet of your radius, the radial styloid is kind of like your feet, is literally moving. Look how close that lives to the wrist joint. It lives right there, but it is not the wrist joint. So it's easy to see how people would say, well, you know, I have my radius and that articulates with the carpals, but the radius wrapping and unwrapping itself about the ulna has nothing to do with the carpal bone. Okay? All right? It's a separate joint. It's a pivot joint. It's just like your atlas axis. I'll get to it when we get back from break. But my point is that, you know, ulna deviation. I'm sure every single one of you can identify a thumb and a pinky, regardless of if I'm here or if I'm here. And so you just identify where that pinky is, ulna side, radial side, ulna side, radial side. Okay? Any questions? How many motions can we have at the wrist? 4, good. Is hyperflexion a separate motion? It's the same motion. It just means you went a little further in a flexed position than what you're allowed for. Hyperextension, same thing. A little too far. And that's a relative term. Some people are super flexible. They may have more motion than the average person. So their hyper may be further down the road than other people's hyper. That's okay. Some people may be real stiff, tight. Their hyper might be less than other people's hyper. It's a relative concept, but it's not a separate motion. 2 directions of spin per plane. Okay? On the test, I would say that most students would make the careless mistake of counting pronation and supination as a wrist joint motion. So they'd say 6. Do 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 do. Ooh, here's a good rap. You know what else is a good rap? Legends. They've got really good raps. Am I right? All right, how we do this? All right, so moving up the chain, right? Here's our wrist joint. Wrist can move in its sagittal, flexion, extension, radial, ulna, deviation. Do you see how we actually talked about this with the subtalar joint? I remember, I think it was someone on the left side of class. It was a great question. It was basically, why do we have more motion one way than the other? And the answer is typically because we need it. You know, remember that was when I was being silly. Like, you're never gonna plan on your right leg to change your direction and go right. You're gonna plan on the right leg in order to go left. And when you do that, you need to have more inversion to keep your surface area. Your foot flat on the floor. So it's very similar. You have more ulnar deviation than you do radial deviation. Why? Because you're going to be in a position to keep things balanced a lot more ulnar side than you will radial side. And what we gain in mobility, we lose in stability, and vice versa. And I just wanted to show you the similarities of this, where radial deviation is a hard endpoint, man. You get bone smacking on bone. But look how much shallower the medial side is. A lot more space to articulate and move. Yeah? That's how we're structurally made. Places we want to move more, we give more. And places we want to give less, we give less. So it's very similar. For the ankle joint, it's the same thing. Look how further down the lateral fibula is, right? So that way you get more stability when you try to evert. It's the same concept. You see, more space, more motion. Less space, less motion. Same thing here. Less space, less motion. More space, more motion. All right, let's get to the radius. So the radial ulnar joint and the elbow joint, again, live in the same apartment complex. What I mean by that, my athletic trainers will understand this well. When I say the same apartment complex, it means they have the same capsule. They live in the same building, but not necessarily in the same apartment. Does that make sense? So the capsule that encapsulates the elbow, and you know what a capsule basically is? It's a big water balloon, ligamentous structure. And things that we think are ligaments are actually just thickened bands of that water balloon. You know, so really there's like this one big capsular ligament, and then there's thickened bands that we term the ulnar collateral or radial collateral or the anterior talar fibular ligament. That's just thickened bands of the overall capsular ligament in these joints. So the elbow has two main joints that live in the apartment complex, but don't live in the same apartment. One is the literal elbow joint, uniaxial hinge, probably the easiest joint you're going to have in the body, in the fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension, right? But the one that lives below it, that one's a little trickier. The radial ulnar joint. Look at that radial head, built like a clock, circular, round, and it literally is meant to wrap and unwrap itself about the ulna. Easy way to remember it. Radius, rotates. Radius rotates about the ulna. Most of the time. I can fix it and do some crazy stuff, but the point is that the radius is meant to roll like a clock and wrap itself around the ulna. You say, why do we need that? To reposition our hands for functional circle of grip. Literally, to reposition where we need to put our hands in dexterous manners to do stuff. That's the biggest reason. There's a couple other really cool reasons that we'll get into down the road, but the biggest reason is so that I can literally put my hands in a 360-degree function. 360. I get about 180 from wrapping and unwrapping here, and then I get an extra 180 from rolling my shoulder internally. But it's the sum total of all, man. I can get a lot of cool work done when I can reposition my palm. In anatomical position, I am unwrapped. In other words, the radius and the ulna are both laying on their beds, their partners, and they're both face forward. When I have pronation, the act of going prone literally means the act of going face down. That makes sense? So if I go from looking forward to now the head of the radius, if I put some little eyes on there with the magenta marker, you'd see now the eyes are facing down, prone. Pronation, supine, supination, the act of going prone, the act of going supine. So you're really wrapping and unwrapping. Now, like I said earlier, it's impossible to rotate the head without the rest of the bone going along for the ride. So we have a proximal radial ulnar joint, we have a distal radial ulnar joint, but it's still the radial ulnar joint. It's the concept of the radius wrapping and unwrapping. Now, here's the easiest way to tell whether you're wrapped or you're unwrapped. Anatomical landmarks. Again, the fact that the wrist doesn't twist is a powerful tool for us to be able to figure out things. So the name of the game is, am I supine or am I prone? And that is not a global concept. That is a local concept. When we think of prone and supine from an athletic training perspective, we think of it as a global reference. I'm either looking at the ceiling or looking at the floor. But we have to remember, these are local concepts. This is looking forward relative to where you were in anatomical position, or facing down relative to where you were in anatomical position. So in other words, I can be wrapped, but yet technically make it face up globally. But locally, it's still face down. Yeah? Okay, you with me? And that's where people are going to get it confused, because when you just learn it with the soup bowl, that's all fine and dandy for that one analogy. But you use a global reference and you say, oh, when I'm supinated, the palm of my hand is facing the ceiling. Well, guess what? Here, I'm pronated and the palm of my hand is facing the ceiling. I'm wrapped. So using those global references, you like what I did there? Using those global references isn't a sure thing, okay? So I'm going to give you more sure ways to see this, and that's anatomical landmarks. So because the wrist doesn't twist, it allows us to note that in anatomical position, my pinky is medial side, and my thumb is lateral side. If I'm, let's say, I represent and my wife represents has anybody had my wife in class? Okay. So my wife and I represent the right radial ulnar joint relationship, okay? If I wrap, and I'm the radius, okay, I'm lateral. If I wrap my body around her and keep my head on my pillow, well, now my feet went to the inside. My feet went medial. So my point is that when you fully pronate, now your thumb is medial side. You brought the foot on the lateral part and wrapped it around to the medial. Pinky is now lateral and thumb is now medial. And when you're unwrapped, pinky will be medial and thumb will be lateral. That's an all the time. And that's because the wrist doesn't twist. Okay? So I do little silly moves like, okay, well, what position am I in? Well, let's check. Here's my pinky. Doop, 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 doop. This is the medial side of my arm. I must be unwrapped. Oh no, what's my position? Oh, it's confusing. Here's my thumb. Doop, 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 doop. Walk it down, man. What part is that? That's the medial side. I must be wrapped. Okay. There is a functional position. Guys, remember position is just anatomical, fetal. there is a functional position of the radioulnar joint called semi-pronated. And it's just a position that we do a lot of stuff with. We hold glasses of butterbeer and root beer with, and we use tools and we do certain things. It's a position we put ourselves in a lot of times, so it gives its own name. Why is that not called a semi-supinated position? Why do you think it's called a semi-pronated position? What you think? Why'd we pick that one and not the other one? Doesn't seem fair. Yeah, what you...
Because in anatomical positions, we're supinated.
That's absolutely right. Because in anatomical position, we're supinated. We have to pronate to get there. If anatomical position was here, we'd be calling it a semi-supinated position. Well done. Okay. I think I pulled something. Great. So once again, names of things make sense if you give it. Did I ever tell y'all why I say that? When I think I was in high school, when I went to visit my great aunt at the old folks home. I know that's not correct, but that's what we called it back in the day. We called it the old folks home. It's a nursing home. And Tante, that for people out of town, Tante is aunt. And we were watching TV. We'd always watch TV, and she was blind, and she couldn't hear very well, but we watched TV together. Hey, Brian, you still here? Yes, ma'am, Tante, I'm here. And this lady rolled up her wheelchair right next to Tonteva, and I was like, ma'am, do you want to watch something else? Now, I might have been like 12, 13 years old, and she did, and I freaked out, dude, and like, I was just like, oh, I gotta go, and I was just like, oh my God, and then I felt so bad, and then I know she's probably dead by now, so I just, to let her know that I love her, and that I think of her every now and then, I'll bring back her memory by just going, That's a true story. All right, so here we go. Wrapping and unwrapping. That's the game, man. Who likes to wrap Christmas presents? Some people find it therapeutic, okay? Wrapping, unwrapping. That's the name of the game for the radioulnar joint. Am I wrapping myself or am I unwrapping myself? And you don't have to full wrap. It could just be a little wrap. Am I in the process of wrapping myself around the ulnar or not? Does that make sense? Am I wrapped? Am I unwrapped? Am I semi-wrapped? That's how I want you to think of this. And again, the reason we have it, so that we can do a lot of stuff with our hands. Repositioning of our hands. Functional circle of grip. Okay? Right radioulnar joint pronation. Right radioulnar joint supination. Right radioulnar joint pronation. Right radioulnar joint supination. Does my radioulnar joint, now that you know, have anything to do with my wrist in terms of motion? In terms of functional tasks, they may work together. They may team up to do stuff, but they are totally independent. So watch what happens when I flex my wrist. I wrap and I unwrap. But it may look different, but it's not. Because my radioulnar joint doesn't care about what my wrist is doing. Just because it might look different. So note on the test, that's why you can't use these global concepts. This is pronation, just as much as this is pronation. But one, I ended with my fingers pointing towards you guys, and the other, I ended with my fingers pointing away. The radioulnar joint doesn't care about that. It's just, am I wrapping myself over my partner, or am I unwrapping myself? So on the test, I'm going to give you some stuff like this. Or, but by that time, you're going to have enough clues to be able to figure it out. Okay? All right, practical question. If you're driving home from class and your hands are on the wheel, and let's say you're not here, you're here, okay, on the sides, and you need to make a left. Let's say right, you're going to turn right, and you're going to keep both hands on the wheel, and you do this. Do you realize if your radioulnar joints weren't able to move, you wouldn't be able to do that? Like just think of those simple tasks that if your radioulnar joint weren't able to move, your hands would do, would do this. But because my left radial ulnar joint was able to wrap, and my right radial ulnar joint was able to unwrap, I was able to keep my grip on the wheel. It's just an example of some practical things that you can do by wrapping and unwrapping. Where are my softball players at? High school? It doesn't matter. What about baseball? Where are my former baseball players at? You realize if you weren't able to move your radial ulnar joints, it's wrapping and unwrapping, man. My left unwraps, and my right wraps. Now, again, just trying to show you some practical usage of wrapping and unwrapping. Okay? Put your hands over your head. Right hand touching your head. Okay? Simon didn't say, just joking. Okay. Now what I'd like for you to do is go from the palm of your hand touching your head to the palm of your head touching the ceiling. Don't answer it out loud. Think about it. What did your radial ulnar joints do? Don't answer it out loud. Think about it, and then I will allow you to discuss with your neighbor to see if you'll get the same answer. You go from your palm facing the ground to your palm facing the ceiling. I gave you global clues, but does the radial ulnar joint move from a global reference? No, it moves from a local reference. That's why we can't use things like, when it's facing here, when it's facing there. That could get us into trouble, okay? Discuss it with your neighbor and see if y'all get the same thing. If you don't get the same answer, then one of you has to play lawyer and convince the other that you're right. Palm down to palm up. Did I wrap or unwrap? Or maybe none of these. That's always fun. I want to see some of y'all driving on Johnson Street like this. Officer, I was just reviewing. All right, did I wrap or unwrap? Wrapped. I pronated. Now, a couple things. If you learned it, and listen, I'm not dissing the people that's, sometimes it's just easy to say it's this, and then you move on. But if you learned it with the soup bowl, that could be hard for you because, again, supination, palm facing the ceiling. Global reference here. But when I'm here, I know that I'm unwrapped to start with. And how do I know that? Because I can reposition my palm, still hitting my head, and show you that I'm in anatomical position. Or I can do my little doop, 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 pinky's lateral. Thumb's lateral, pinky's medial. Here's where people get it confused because you want to hold on to those global references, man, I get it. But when I do this, and students will bring it back down to anatomical, watch what they do. This is brilliantly sly. And they supinate as they bring it down, and thus change the position of what they had at the top. That's how strong you want to keep your global reference. You want to say, my hand is facing up here, so when I bring it down, I still want to face. Well, guess what? You just moved your radial ulnar joint. So that's why I do things like this, to show you that when you bring your hand down, you reposition your hand globally while maintaining the same position locally. This is right radial ulnar joint pronation. I'm wrapped. That's an important one to learn because our radial ulnar joints, another thing they do is they work with my shoulders to keep my hands in certain positions. What do I mean by that? Superman flies pronated, yes? Would we say so? Right? Well, in anatomical position, if Superman was going to fly, he'd have to move his shoulders, and then he'd have to move his radial ulnar joint so that he could fly pronated, right? Watch how subtle, I love this, watch how subtle the radial ulnar joint motion is. Watch how subtle, you can't even notice it. Did you notice the radial ulnar joint motion? But I know I had to have it because I'm pronated. I start out supinated. I do this, don't notice much, but when I come back down, I'm pronated. Because the radial ulnar joint motion is happening simultaneously and mirrorly with shoulder motion. So I know we start off with these obvious wrappings and unwrappings, but eventually it's going to be very subtle. Did you guys know that you move your radial ulnar joint when you do your upright row? If you didn't, the bar would look like this when you come up to it. You do this in order to keep your fingers under the bar. I start off in a pronated position. I do this. Guess what? I had supination. It's subtle, yet important, and it's stuff we have to be able to see. The people who work, no offense to them, the law says they can do it. But people that work in the gym with the bro science and the magazine subscriptions, they have no clue how radial ulnar joint motion works because they weren't taught. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. We need to know how these things work. We need to really know how the body works above just knees, elbows, and hips. There's a lot of cool things that happen with the body. All right? Y'all have a safe break.